Welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. This is your host, Laura. I'm a licensed master social worker and therapist in New York City. Today, we have a very special guest joining us from the UK, Vicki. She's a frontline child protection worker. So today, we'll be diving into the differences in social work in the US and the UK and everything that comes with that. So thank you so much, Vicki, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, excited to have you. Would you like to share a little bit about yourself to those listening?
Yes, so as you said, I'm a frontline child protection social worker and I'm a practice educator. So I could go into a little bit more about that later in terms of how social workers are trained in the UK. But I started my page Social Work Sorted about a year ago because I felt like there was a bit of a gap definitely in UK training between kind of that academic social work and then practice. Really, what did that look like for people? And although there were lots of ways and methods that people could be taught, I felt like some of the bigger ideas needed to be broken down, and it's had a really positive reception. So it's definitely shown me that a lot more work needs to be done, definitely in the UK. And I've obviously connected with a lot of people outside of the UK as well who've had the same issues.
Absolutely. What are some of those biggest issues that you've noticed?
I think for me, it's a lot of the practical skills that I needed, a lot of the I suppose different steps of interaction between people, a lot of the behavior or the choices that social workers have to make when they're in the moment experiencing the different challenges. So for example, where do you sit when you're on a home visit, or how do you actually manage somebody when unfortunately they might be being abusive to you over the phone? How do you talk somebody down when they're at a really high level and you need to manage that conflict? So there's a lot of focus on theory, but I think social workers struggle bringing that into practice. So I think that's one of the main issues I find.
Absolutely. Because it's two different worlds. What we read in a textbook versus how we actually apply that in real life can be very different.
Absolutely. And I think because there isn't a one size fits all approach, it's difficult to do a kind of how to for every scenario. But there don't seem to be many how to's for each scenario to begin with. So I think it's a good place to start, really.
Absolutely. In terms of becoming a social worker, can you first tell the listeners how you came to social work and your personal journey?
Yeah, so I actually trained, so I did my bachelor's degree in drama and theatre arts.
Oh, great.
So that was always a big interest of mine. I was interested in community theatre, and I sort of had some plans to go into art therapy or drama therapy.
Oh, great.
Throughout my degree, I worked in the social care field, so I worked with children with disabilities, with adults with disabilities. And then when I graduated, I worked for a community theatre company that was based in a homeless hostel, and tried to engage adults who were impacted by homelessness, which I loved. It was amazing. It was such a good job, and it was everything that I loved all in one, and it had a massive impact on people. And we had an amazing group of people. They built so much confidence, and really kind of grounded for me the knowledge that using arts in therapy and in social work and in communities is really important. And so from doing that and from working alongside that, I worked with adults with life-limiting illnesses in a residential unit. I then decided to go and do the social work masters, which is a 2-year course in the UK. So it's academic and practical. You do, or when I did it, you did one 60-day placement, I think, and then one 100-day placement across the 2 years. And once you finish that, you can then apply to be registered as a social worker in the UK. So my final placement was in child protection, and that's then the first job that I got, and I just stayed in
Mm,
that area really. I've worked in different authorities in the UK, so
mhm.
some in the south and around London, and now up north. So yeah, that's
Oh,
the
wow.
long-winded version.
There we go. Very interesting. And I love how that foundation for you is like the arts and theater, because I've seen that in the work that I do, how that's so important, especially for all populations. I did a lot of work with children and teens, and that was a great tool for them too. But for everyone, it can be so expressive and empowering. So that's great.
Yeah, it definitely builds confidence, and I think
Mhm.
a lot of my social work training, there wasn't too much of it, but a lot of it is role play and how are
Mhm.
you going to have these conversations. And when I work with newly qualified social workers, I will do a lot of that and tell them to practice. And people feel really uncomfortable doing it, and
Mhm.
people feel really on the spot, but it's so important to do. That's how
Yes.
you're going to build your skills again and again. So
Mhm.
yeah, I had a good foundation for that really.
That's great. Yeah, I know, especially when I was an undergrad and in grad school, we did some role plays in some classes. And even though in the moment I hated it, and I felt so uncomfortable
Yeah,
and on the spot, looking back, was the those were the moments I felt the most prepared for the situations I'm in now, because that's
absolutely.
as real as you can get when you're in a classroom setting.
Yeah,
Mm,
there's so much power in rehearsing things,
hmm
practicing things, going through different scenarios of what might possibly happen, and
hmm
literally practicing what you might say. It might not be exactly the same in that situation, but I think
hmm
having said something out loud and practiced it almost like a script can really help, especially when you're
hmm
newly qualified.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. I know, so in the US, at least my pathway to social work was I actually started off as a nursing major when I was at community college. So I was going to get my 2-year degree, my associates, and I found out about social work, and I'm just like, social work is way better than nursing for me. So I changed my major. I got my 2-year degree in human services or social work. And during that
Okay.
2-year degree, I did do a 1-year internship at a foster care agency, which when you're at
Okay.
that educational level, there's not a lot you can do. I was more just
Yeah.
shadowing and kind of just observing. I then transferred to a 4-year school. I transferred into my junior year as a social work major. Um, I got my bachelor's in social work, and a part of that experience was I did another year-long internship at a child advocacy center. So we worked with kids and
Okay.
families that had experienced child sexual abuse and trafficking and more severe forms of physical abuse as well. Because I had my bachelor's in social work, when I applied to grad school, I only had to do a 1-year long program to get my master's in social work. So
Okay.
yeah, so other people that were in the same program as me, if they came from like, they had their 4-year degree in psychology or history or something like that, they typically did a 2-year program in order to get their
Okay.
master's. So
So sort of similar to
sort of,
over here, I guess. Yeah.
yeah. And during the master's, you do a year-long internship as well. So, and that's where for that, I mean, you're in your master's program, it's way more hands-on. You're kind of just thrown into the mix. And I started practicing as a therapist during that placement. So, yeah.
So for me, that seems to be the biggest difference when I look at like the qualifications. So in the UK, to be a kind of registered therapist, there is a
hmm
different route that you would have
Okay.
to take in terms of your qualifications.
Hmm.
Whereas when I kind of see in the US, kind of social workers, but also describing themselves as therapists, that seems to
hmm
be a massive sort of difference or massive shift that there's. I don't know if it's just my perception being from the UK that there seem to be more options in the US for
Mm.
social workers because of that difference in therapy or what therapy means
hmm
or looks like.
Yeah, I do know a vast majority in the United States, a vast majority of therapists are licensed social workers. And I
Okay.
know in order to be a therapist, you have to at least have your master's degree in social work and you have to be licensed. For other roles in social work, like I could have stopped school after my 2-year degree. And so I could have my associates in human services and work as a case manager. Um, where I'm from is a very rural community. And I think that's the nuance of it too, is depending on where you are in the United States, the qualifications are different. Being in New York City now, in order to be a social worker at any level, they're looking for a master's degree. Where I was raised in a very small rural community, the majority of people in social services didn't have a degree, didn't have a license. It was really only therapists that were social workers. So a lot of people that were working in child protection, they did a 5-month course and then were on their way to being child protection workers. So depends on where you are. More metro areas require higher level of qualifications, and more rural areas are just desperate for workers. So they'll kind of just do a quick training with someone and send them on their way.
So we have it, I don't know how similar it is, but in the UK we have an organisation called Frontline. So that is it's registered as a charity, but it's an organisation built from a response that, you know, we were lacking in child protection social workers in the UK. So it's almost like a fast track to social work. Frontline probably wouldn't describe it as that, but for a lot of people it's a fast track. So you have to be a graduate from any degree you can have. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to social work. And then I think within a year you can move to being qualified, and you do placements throughout that year, but it's a paid course. But it's open to quite a lot of criticism at the moment in the UK because of the funding streams and the connection with the government, and how it doesn't prioritize people who want to go into social work who are from sort of diverse backgrounds. So yeah, it's quite a contentious issue at the moment in the UK and with social work. So, but it's advertised as really a response to, like you're saying, recruitment, and there not being enough numbers. But there's two very different schools of thought between academic qualifications and doing the BA and doing the masters, and then frontline, and then there's obviously very different costs to the economy of both those different things. So yeah, it's very current at the moment in social work in terms of how people are qualifying, really. But we have, I suppose it's different because you talk about being licensed. So once a social worker in the UK has done their qualification, we apply to the health, it's a HCPC, and I'm going to forget what it stands for. It's like the Healthcare Professionals Council. But you apply, and then you are a registered social worker. But we don't have to do specific exams or anything for that. Whereas I know in the US, you know, to be licensed, you have to pass exams, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. And I know, so we have the ASWB, the Association of Social Work Boards, which does the exam. And it's weird because it's a national exam. So it's like the same exam everywhere, but the qualifications to get a license differ based on what state you're in. So I'm in New York State. And so like I'm a licensed master social worker, but in New Jersey, there's not really a thing called a licensed master social worker. You're just a licensed social worker. And so, and I think that's a point of contention in the United States, is how there's not like a one path to licensure. Like it's so different. And then if you move to another state, you have to apply for licensure all over again and take that state's exam, even though it's the same exam that you took in another state. So it's kind of messy. You can take the licensing exam with your bachelor's degree. I don't know a lot of people that do that because to my knowledge, like if you have a bachelor's in social work, not a lot of agencies are looking for like a licensed social worker at the bachelor's level. If you have your license, they're probably looking for you to have a master's degree. And then I took mine a year after I graduated with my master's. There were some people I knew who were able to take it like right after or at graduation. When you're allowed to take the exam depends on what state you're in. I know some people.
It massively depends.
Yeah. Some people in New Jersey, they're able to take the exam while they're still in school. So that way they're all licensed and ready to go as soon as they graduate. For me, I had to get a temporary permit that showed I passed all my classes. I had my degree in social work. I just hadn't taken the exam yet. So
Okay.
it's a whole thing. Now that I'm a LMSW, a licensed master social worker, the next license is to be a licensed clinical social worker. So that's after
Okay.
like 3 years of practice, or at least 3,000 clinical hours. Like you're working as a therapist, you're doing direct social work practice, usually with diagnosis and with mental health treatment. Then I take another exam and with the practice hours, and then I can become a clinical social worker. That for me
Wow.
means once I get to that point, you're able to have your own private practice. I think some are insurance changes. So that's why a lot of people go that route. And again,
Okay.
it depends on the state that you're in. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a whole other world, isn't it? So we
Mm-hmm.
have to, once we're registered with the HCPC, we have to pay for our registration. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes if you're employed by the local authority, like the government,
Mm-hmm.
or within your local area, then you will get that refunded. Sometimes you don't. It's like 45, I think it's £45 a year, or £45 every 6 months. Um, and then you have to prove that you've done continuous professional development. So you've attended certain training
Mm-hmm.
throughout the year, and you have to keep a record of it. But there's no exams,
Mm-hmm.
and it's I suppose it's an interesting difference between the two,
Mm-hmm.
that the level of exams and level of qualification that you have to have
Mm-hmm.
and sort of continue to prove. But we wouldn't. The equivalent really would be practicing as an independent social worker. But
Mm.
even to be an independent social worker in the UK, there's nothing that you have to do differently. You obviously have to have your
Okay.
own separate insurance, but
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't necessarily be sort of seeing people in the same way that you would as a
Mm-hmm.
clinical therapist, seeing them in your
Sure.
own practice. But you might be doing court work or assessments, but you would just be doing
Mm.
that independently, kind of as a self-employed worker. But
Okay.
there's no requirement. Yeah, I guess there's no minimum requirement type of
Mm-hmm.
thing with that. So a lot of the time, for example, if I was in court and kind of solicitors or barristers were looking for an independent social worker,
Mm-hmm.
you would just base that on their CV and perhaps their years of experience.
Okay.
Rather, that would be kind of the basics of what you would have to go on,
Mm-hmm.
rather than proof of that they'd passed a certain exam or
Mm.
anything. So yeah, a lot of it maybe experience is equated with years qualified, which isn't
Mm-hmm.
always an accurate sort of representation, I guess,
Mm.
of how good a social worker is.
Sure. That's what's hard about the licensing exam though too, is some people just are not good test takers. And I mean, I've been helping some people with tutoring for the exam, and I was able to pass it on my first attempt. But while you're being taught like how to study for the exam, it's so strange because you're always told you basically can't think like a social worker, right? Because the questions are almost trying to trick you, like they're trying to ask, like, in an ideal world, in the perfect situation, what would you
Yeah,
do right now? And it's so strange. So a lot of the times it's a question of, is this really showing that I'm equipped to do the job, when we're being taught answer the questions like you're not a social worker? And so it just seems
yeah.
like another thing. And the exams cost, I think, around $300. And
Oh wow.
yeah, and so the first time I had scheduled it, I had actually scheduled it for really early in the morning, and I had been working with my temporary permit, so I had overslept and I had missed my exam, and I couldn't get a refund. So then I had to pay another $300 when I
Oh
registered
wow.
for it again. So I mean, there's certainly the
Expensive.
financial component that's there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
And I think that I've seen some of the example like questions that you have, and
Mhm.
it is interesting because you think social work is just so complex.
Mhm.
How can you break that down into a this is the right answer in this scenario? And if,
Mhm.
like you say, it it's almost the ideal scenario. If X, Y, and Z happened, what would you do? Whereas
Mhm.
we know that doesn't happen with humans and human relationships. So
Mhm.
I guess that's the difficulty of it, in terms of how do you measure that a social
Mhm.
worker understands what to do. And I think that's the difference between the academic and the practice
Mhm.
placements. I have newly qualified social workers saying, you know, they learnt about the foundations of social work, and they learnt
Mhm.
about systemic injustice, and they learnt all that, but then they started their placement and they had to be able to do a written assessment, or they had to
Mm.
be able to write a court report, and they didn't know how to do that because that part wasn't taught to them,
Mm.
which is difficult. Because equally, I don't think that we should turn our academic degree into a step by step local authority social work. This is how you're supposed to write an assessment, because I think you
Mhm.
have to have those foundations to be able to understand why people are where they are, really. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's kind of important to have a measure in one way, but then, as you say, there's so many scenarios that could
Yeah.
possibly happen, that who decides what the right answer is in
Mhm.
some of them, I guess. And maybe they're just the examples that I've seen,
Mhm.
but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to say the least. And it's
Yeah,
very
definitely.
nuanced. Yeah. You had mentioned, so you talked about kind of the practice placements. Can you tell us like what your experience was like in practice during those placements?
Yeah, so it's a long time ago now, but my
Mhm.
first practice placement was in a drug and alcohol um, community centre, I suppose. So it was the local authority, which is what we would call sort of like the local area, or the local council,
Mhm.
had a drug and alcohol service. And my placement was within a charity, but it was commissioned to do work for the
Mhm.
council. So um, people who had issues with drugs and alcohol would be referred to the service, and they could get sort of one-to-one support around that. So
Mhm.
it wasn't it wouldn't have been considered counselling or therapy. It was
Mhm.
more sort of support based around motivational interviewing and
Mhm.
goal setting. And it was we worked alongside another unit, I suppose, or community unit, that would offer prescriptions for people. So, for example,
Mhm.
methadone prescriptions or Subutex prescriptions if they were trying to get off heroin. Um, and that was it was a lovely placement. The staff that I
Mhm.
worked with were lovely, and it was a really good opportunity to kind of practice those interpersonal skills with people.
Mhm.
I suppose the challenge was that I often didn't feel fully, because I wasn't fully qualified, but I didn't
Mhm.
often feel qualified to have some of the conversations I was having. So
Sure.
often the people that were coming to the centre who were having significant problems with drugs and alcohol, there was
Mhm.
obviously so many levels of things that were going on for them
Mhm.
that went straight back to childhood, that really
Yeah.
probably what they needed was a more intensive therapy. But
Mhm.
even, I mean, this state of services now in the UK is really difficult. It's in a worse place now than it was then, but even then it was
Mm.
really difficult to get that level of intervention for people. So,
Mm.
but the part that I loved about it was also a place where people could come and access, and turn up for a cup of tea, and you
Mhm.
know meet people and have informal chats as well. And it was a sort of hub for community groups. So whether it was
Mhm.
Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, they all held groups there as well. So that was separate to what the agency sort of did,
Mhm.
but it just meant that where I had consent, I was able to sit in on some of those meetings,
Mm.
which was really, really interesting. And I suppose it was kind of a lot of soaking up
Oh yeah.
information, and soaking, rather than me being in practice, I
Mhm.
felt. But that was important too. And then my second placement was in a frontline child protection team. So
Mhm.
we were taking, from the point of kind of getting a referral,
Mm.
going out and doing initial assessments, to the point of where a case would become a child protection case, and then
Mhm.
it would transfer to a different team. So that was kind of really my foundations, I would guess, of
Mm.
going out practicing. I didn't hold any cases by myself, which I don't believe students should do.
Yeah.
But it was going out with experienced social workers and responding to referrals as and when they came in. So some of those were emergency situations, some of them weren't. So I got a massive range of experience then, and I met some, really lovely children and families. So yeah, that was kind of how I liked the pace of it. I liked the work. And that was how I kind of knew that's what I wanted to go into when I
Oh,
qualified.
wonderful. Great. How long was
Yeah.
that placement again?
So the final one was 100 days. So I
Okay.
don't even know how many months that is. Probably just over 3 months. Yeah. So that was like
Okay.
a Monday. I think I did Monday to Friday, like 9 to 5.
Oh, wow. Okay. Also doing like classes and coursework at the same time, or was this separate?
So again, it feels like a long time ago, but we had sort of work to do on the placement. So we had to keep reflective journals, and we had to
Okay.
obviously keep a log of what we were doing on placement. And we have certain it's called the professional capabilities framework, but we had certain kind of goals that we needed to meet on that placement. And then from what I remember, I had to go back into university maybe a few times within that to do sort of skills development days, they called them then. But we didn't have, I think we had some essays that ran alongside the practice placement, but they tried to do I suppose like set modules before you did your practice placement, and then say from like January to May you would have your placement time. So I don't know if that's different to what you had, because
Okay.
but I know certainly there is. I think when I've kind of been a practice educator for students, they've definitely had their academic work running alongside their placement work, and then that makes it really difficult.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about it now. I know there are some colleges in the US that do that, where they're more like 3 months, like almost working full time, and they kind of break it up in that way. For a lot of, I think for the majority of schools, it was similar to my experience where you were doing both at the same time, but that's probably
Oh
why
wow.
it was a year-long placement, because we weren't working 9 to 5. We would work like a couple of half days, and I can't remember the hour amount that we needed. I don't know, like 170 hours, maybe.
Okay.
So we had to have like the hour requirement filled. And so for some people, depending, I guess, on how their layout was structured, I like for some colleges, they were able to just do all their coursework first semester. Next semester, they did their placement. But for the majority of us, it's at the same time. But that's why it's a year-long
Ah,
placement.
okay. That makes sense,
Yeah.
because I see different things about, or hear different things about workload. But yeah, for me it was helpful to have it sort of blocked off and
Mm-hmm.
separated, and doing it sort of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5,
Yeah.
you kind of immersed in the way the team functions, and
Mm-hmm.
you can see through cases, I suppose, from the start to the end of
Mm-hmm.
whatever's happening. So yeah, I guess it would be different having maybe one day a week for a whole year.
Yeah. And I think I do like the 9 to 5 layout better because, like you said, it is more immersive. And I remember
Mm,
when I was an undergrad, at least, I mean, there were some days because my schedule was so hectic where I'd be only like 3 hours, I'd be there for the day. And they couldn't guarantee if like clients would be there. And so some days I'd count the hours, but I wasn't really getting a lot of client contact or actual
yeah,
practice in.
yeah. And
Mm.
I suppose as well, it depends on your circumstance. I
Mm-hmm.
had a student a few years ago who she, you know, it also depends on your like distance to the placement. So she was
Yeah.
traveling a significant distance, because students don't get to choose their placements, they get
Mm.
allocated them. So she had to travel a significant distance. She had 3 children. She was
Mm.
sort of obviously with us in the office 9 to 5, and it's an unpaid placement. So although some mileage is covered, it wasn't enough. So yeah, I guess different people, different circumstances would have
Mm-hmm.
different things, but it's certainly, you know, really intense. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
again, going back to what's happening in the UK at the moment with the frontline program,
Mm-hmm.
that obviously the financial reimbursement for people taking part in that is higher.
Yeah.
And it's obviously lower when you're doing a
Mm-hmm.
university degree that you have to pay for, or you have to fund yourself or through student loans. So
Yeah.
I think that's the thing. It's creating a bit of a disparity between social workers depending on their background and what they can
Mm-hmm.
afford to do, really.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess some would prefer doing the 1 day a week to be able to balance life the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's tough. That's interesting too that you mentioned just the background of the social workers. I've noticed more and more in the US, a lot of employers requiring a master's degree and requiring a license. So the level of education keeps getting higher, but the pay for when you're actually in that position is not necessarily getting higher as well. So we're being asked to, take out student loans or pay a significant amount of money for college education. But then many people I've seen, they have their master's in social work and are paid minimum wage, which is just, the US is not sustainable. So I'm wondering how that relates to in the UK.
Yeah, it depends on lots of things. It depends on what local authority you work in. So
Mm-hmm.
pay is different,
Okay.
depending on where you live.
Mm-hmm.
Um, pay is always kind of higher in London. There's a kind
Mm-hmm.
of a London weighting added, but yeah, across local authorities, if you look at jobs that are going, the pay is completely different. But for newly qualified social workers, um, it's still, I think at the moment it's probably higher than maybe if you were a newly qualified nurse.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, again, that's why a lot of people would probably kind of show a preference to doing a program that is funded, rather than, again, if you're doing a university degree and then coming out as
Mm-hmm.
a newly qualified social worker. A lot of places will ask you to do, um, we call it an ASYE, so an assessed
Mm-hmm.
and supported year in employment, which is a lower wage. You're supposed to have lower caseloads. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's always the case.
Mm-hmm.
And you have, quite a large portfolio that you have to produce in that year to almost pass that ASYE year,
Mm-hmm.
which again, I think it differs depending on where you go to. So there isn't, yeah, a lot of it is a bit of a postcode lottery, really, but it
Mm-hmm.
definitely isolates people who are coming from poorer backgrounds who
Mm-hmm.
kind of can't afford that, really. And
Yeah.
again, it depends on what area of social work that you work in. I think some local authorities pay um, higher for child protection social workers
Mm.
than for adult social workers, or they have certain kind of additional benefits that they would maybe add to the
Mm-hmm.
wage, because I think everywhere just wants to try and retain social workers at the moment. And
Mm-hmm.
then we have the issue of agencies. So you can be employed by a local authority, or you can be employed by an agency. And agents,
Mm.
although I think they've capped it now, agency social workers are paid at a higher rate. They
Okay.
cost local authorities more. And I've been an agency social
Mm-hmm.
worker as well, so I can see it from both sides. Obviously, as an agency social worker, you don't have any of the benefits of being in employment, but the wage is higher.
Mm.
But there are some issues around retention of agency staff, that an agency
Mm-hmm.
staff member can essentially come into the authority, work for a few weeks, and then leave if they don't like it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Mm.
But yeah, so there's lots of different things going on in terms of pay and social workers at the
Mm.
moment.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Earlier you had mentioned the difference between like social work and being a therapist. So like in the United States, a lot of, social workers, I think like 85% of mental health professionals are social workers. So, and there's many different pathways to become a therapist in the US. If you have your degree in psychology, I think you need at least a master's or a doctorate in order to practice as a therapist. To be a therapist as a social worker, you just need your master's and a license. You can also be a licensed mental health counselor, which is a different degree. You go to school to get your degree in counseling. So there's a lot of different paths. What does that look like in the UK in order to be a therapist?
So it's quite different. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
There we go. We'll get there eventually, won't we? So, yeah, so I suppose the first thing is when you qualify as a social worker in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
you can effectively get a job in any area. So, say I qualified from my master's course,
Mm-hmm.
there were people who I qualified with who went straight into mental health teams.
Mm-hmm.
Some people went straight into general adult teams, some people went into children's teams. So it didn't, sometimes your practice placement will impact that. So you might
Mm-hmm.
have a practice, whatever you have your practice placement in, you could go into that. But adult mental health social workers wouldn't have the qualifications to diagnose
Mm.
it, in this country. So if you were going to get a mental health diagnosis, you would be looking at a psychologist or a doctor or a psychiatrist, it would be. So what mental health social workers can do is qualify as an approved mental health practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, I might get this wrong because it's not my area, but I think that's a year's qualification. And
Mm.
what that means is if somebody presents as potentially needing to be detained under a section of the Mental Health Act,
Mm-hmm.
the AMP, the approved mental health practitioner, would be able to do that alongside a psychiatrist.
Okay.
So in terms of therapists, you have to obviously be a registered, or I suppose it would be like a licensed therapist if you were
Mm-hmm.
in the UK. If you were as a social worker, I would have to go and retrain again to like the equivalent of another master's degree
Mm-hmm.
to be able to work as a therapist or offer therapy. So I
Okay.
think that there's different levels of qualification. So sometimes
Mm.
people might work as and counselling is also different. So I don't know if it's the same over there, but
Okay. What's counseling for you?
so counselling would be a different qualification. So
Okay.
the you can obviously qualify at different levels
Mm-hmm.
of counselling. So yeah, we would see a counsellor and a therapist as two different things almost. And then in
Mm-hmm.
terms of therapy, there's obviously the different types of therapy. So whether you are doing psychotherapy or whether you're
Mm-hmm.
a systemic family therapist. So it would always depend on which way you qualified.
Mm. Very interesting. Oh, wow. So it does seem like I was doing a podcast with someone yesterday, and we were talking about how, especially in the United States, it seems like social work is kind of going through an identity crisis. Like we don't really have a solid, clear understanding of what our role is. Like we can practice as a therapist, like case managers, like we kind of do a whole lot of stuff. But it seems like because it seems like there's more structure around like what a social worker does for you.
Yeah, although I do think that's happening in the UK as well, because
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of social workers almost feel like, what's my role? Because
Yeah.
I'm not qualified to do a specific type of therapy. I'm
Mm.
not a qualified counsellor, unless they are, but they're not
Mm-hmm.
usually qualified counsellors. A lot of kind of, if looking at child protection in the UK, it's so risk focused and risk averse
Mm-hmm.
that I think sometimes social workers just feel like they're kind of going through the motions in terms of assessing risk, but
Mm-hmm.
they're not actually doing the direct work with families, either
Mm.
because we, I think, are becoming de-skilled. We don't know how to do it anymore. We've lost the basics. Social
Mm.
workers are so stressed because they've got mountains of paperwork and tick box
Yeah.
exercises to go through. So I would
Mm-hmm.
say it feels the same way over here, because
Mm.
social workers do direct work, but I think there is a kind of
Mm-hmm.
generate, particularly new social workers who've just come out of a pandemic
Mm-hmm.
without having those real proper foundations of training or shadowing, or having people model for them.
Yeah.
Um, there's almost a bit of a fear of doing direct work because they don't
Mm.
really know where they sit in terms of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in the UK, I think a lot of social workers are feeling it and have felt it
Mm-hmm.
for a while, that they don't really know where they sit. And there has been some arguments or some things that I've read which argue that sorry, my voice is going to keep going, which argue that There should be two separate services. There should be services for child protection
Mhm.
and services for kind of family support, because
Mhm.
what's happening at the moment, certainly in children's services, is there is no family support because that sort of early help service has been underfunded and cut.
Mhm.
So problems escalate to the point when at the point when social workers get involved, it then
Mhm.
becomes child protection, and it becomes looking at risk of verse and risk rather than being supportive of the
Mhm.
family. I mean, the answer to all of it really is kind of just fairly funding services over
Mhm.
here, which I think
Yeah,
is probably similar
certainly.
over there. It's yeah,
Mhm.
that would be the really simple answer to it. You know, we
Mhm.
lost a lot of what we called Sure Start centres, so they were set up under the Labour government, and
Mm.
you know, centres that families could access and actually get the support that they needed.
Mhm.
But that that has all now sort of moved under the remit of child protection and that
Mm.
higher level of intervention, really.
Okay, interesting. And I think too, when as social workers, we don't really know, where we are or like what our role is in situations. That's reflective of how the public views social work too. Like they can be uncertain of what do social workers even do? How can I use them as a support and a resource?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think obviously, in the UK, particularly when you're thinking of children's social workers,
Mhm.
the narrative, which I think is probably the same in the US, is that, we take children away
Mhm.
from their families, or we don't take children away from their families when they should have been
Mm.
perhaps taken out of a dangerous situation. And it's those kind of polarizing views, really.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of fear, and I understand that fear of families. Of It's very difficult to go in and say, I'm here to help you,
Mhm.
when know that you're working under a government that isn't helping people
Mhm.
that need help.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also difficult when families have had social workers before, to
Mhm.
build up that trusting relationship, to know that they can help. And I also think upskilling social workers in direct work so they know that they can help. So
Mm.
one local authority that I worked in was training social workers in systemic family therapy.
Mm.
So although you could do the foundational course, it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you're a systemic family therapist, because
Right.
that's a kind of a four year kind of course in itself.
Mhm.
But what it meant was you had the foundations of that. So for
Mhm.
me, I felt really skilled in being able to go into a family, working with them, doing a genogram, using
Mhm.
that as an assessment tool, using that as an intervention with them so they could look
Mm.
at the different family relationships and different patterns, and almost facilitate that
Mhm.
with the family. And those kind of skills I didn't learn in my newly qualified year. I didn't
Mhm.
learn them when I was at university. And when I learned them on the systemic family therapy course, it kind of clicked for me of,
Mhm.
oh, this is what it means when I'm doing direct work with families, and this is how helpful it
Mm.
can be. Whereas if you don't have that foundational training
Mhm.
and you're going out to visits, like I find some newly qualified social workers, you're going out to visits, you're going through the motions, you're doing certain checks, you're
Mhm.
asking certain questions, but you're not scratching the surface of what's going on for that
Right.
family. And I think a lot of that's confidence in being able
Mhm.
to do that. A lot of that is about the identity crisis of, is this my
Mhm.
role? Should I be having these conversations? Or can I, am I qualified to a level that I can have
Mm.
these conversations?
Yeah.
Or should it be someone else? But the reality in the UK is, for a lot of families, there isn't anyone else, because the
Mhm.
threshold to get a higher level of intervention or therapy is so high that
Mm.
my view is we need to be upskilling social workers to do this
Mhm.
work, because otherwise we're just, I mean, we're not turning into robots. I'm not suggesting that, but you know, y- social workers aren't having the basic communication skills and
Mhm.
interpersonal skills and direct work skills to
Mhm.
bring about change.
Right.
So we're just going through the motion of these processes with poor families who
Mhm.
are kind of going to meeting after meeting. We're making plan after plan, but there's no way to get from A to B, because somebody at some point has to do that work with the family. And it feels to me quite often that all the professionals that are involved are kind of thinking, oh, well, it's either not my role or not my remit, or I don't know how to do that work.
Certainly, looking at those gaps in services and just making support and treatment more accessible to the people that need it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, there's just, there's so much about social work that's happening in the UK. It can't even be covered. But yeah, I think in my area in child protection, it's just the criticism has been for many years that it's become process driven, a lot of red tape, it's very risk averse, and it doesn't actually offer any intervention. So it's just sort of process after process until either something changes or nothing changes, and we just escalate to the point where we're in care proceedings in court, and that's never where you want to be with a family. When you think if intervention is done earlier down the line, it's obviously more helpful.
Absolutely.
I think like I say, the problem is we don't have services to do those things, and we're at risk of social workers not having the skills to be able to do those things either. And then if they do have the skills, they don't have the time because they're so inundated and overworked. So
yeah, it all just feeds
gone down
into
a very
each other.
negative really negative hole of all the problems of social work. But I do think about that identity crisis. It's really important for us to think about, because depending on what area of social work you work in, you might have a different view on that. But it is definitely in the UK, like where do we sit in terms of the comparison with counselling, with therapists, with psychologists? It's all about sort of qualifications, I think, and where you're learning from.
Absolutely. Trying to find our place at the table so we can offer like the unique support that social work can do. It's an interesting dance, certainly.
It is, isn't it? I think sometimes I feel, and again, because I like looking at things systemically, I've really kind of connected with systemic family therapy when I did the foundational course. And I do think what social workers will always have is that political overview or that systemic overview. So being able to offer that perspective is probably, for me, one of the kind of unique things about social work, that we're able to step back and look at everything that's going on for a person or a family, rather than just kind of focusing always on the individual, looking at the wider systems. I guess when I try and think about what makes social work unique, it's the advocating for people, or kind of advocating for the fact that things aren't working the way they should work for people, really. So I guess that's always a good spin to have on it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be, I think, the struggle in social work with qualifications and finding our space, but leaning back into the thing, like why we're here in the first place. Like we do have a unique perspective, and the advocacy that we provide is not really something I see in other professions. And so those are strengths we can lean into, certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you so much, Vicki, for coming on to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I've loved this conversation with you. For the listeners that want to continue to follow your journey, where can they follow you?
So first I'll say thank you, and what the listeners won't hear is all the times that Laura has had to pause this recording because I'm having COVID coughs and having to stop the camera. So thanks for your patience with my little coughing fit. So listeners can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Social Work Sorted, and then from there you can access my podcast, which is relatively new and kind of short form. I write for an online magazine, My Social Work News, and put content on my Instagram and on Facebook at Social Work Sorted. So yeah.
Wonderful. All right. And I'll have all that in the description of the podcast as well. Thank you all so much for listening. Feel free to like and follow the podcast on whatever platform you're tuning in on, and we'll see you next time.